10 minutes for questions. Could you just pop up your hands so I could come to a few of you? Okay. Take these three first.
Should I go? Okay. Hi, so again, fantastic presentations, and I want to pick up on the last presentation, and in fact, the exact thing you asked, which is what does a smart city mean, or like when do you actually begin to feel that you live in one, or that it's even begun to surface, and kind of pose the same question then to people working on India. And have you ever sort of figured out when would people say, hey, now we live in a smart city, or something's happening? So is it located in artifacts, et cetera, and do dashboards, I'm selfishly very interested in dashboards, so do dashboards play a role in this whole process? Is that like the artifact in which things are concentrated? And then relatedly to all of you, what I feel is whether the smart city happens or not, there's definitely a sort of numerical death drive to count everything, which sort of relates back to the informality and informal sector. So can you comment a little bit on that?
Thank you. Second question.
Thank you very much. Another really interesting panel, and I was very grateful for the move-in start this afternoon. Just a question, I think it really relates to the last presentation by Robert, sorry, is it? Yes, but probably speaks to all of them as well, really. And I just wondered about the ways in which we're articulating our sort of theorizations of smart cities. And you, Robert, were sort of, utilising notions of assemblages and reconfigurations and so on. And I've sort of utilised some of that in my own work to a degree, but I keep sort of hitting a bit of a buffer every time I'm trying to sort of deploy these sorts of ideas, in the sense that I begin to wonder where the space is, the potentiality is for the political to enter that. In other words, the transformative potential of these ideas. They give us very beautiful kind of configurations and very beautiful ways of thinking about things and understanding things, but where's the political, where's the transformative? How do we put that back in to understanding these processes?
Thank you. And third question.
Thanks. I have a question specifically about the citizen participation that Julie was talking about, but also I think this connects a lot of what we've heard today about smart cities. And my own research focuses mostly lately on Helsinki in Finland, but a lot of the things that you mentioned about the question of to what extent is participation actually really about participation, and to what extent is about tokenism. And what I've noticed in my own research is that quite often it's more about organizing successful communication. So the idea that urban planners have difficulties communicating their plans to the citizens, and when citizens participate, they actually are much more receptive to communication. So, and the aim of many city planning participation strategy seems to be more of successful communicating of what is going on. One of the questions, or the key question I would like to ask then is it perhaps also because a lot of these institutions and people doing city participation, they are geared towards quantitative data. And the smart city in itself is also geared towards quantitative data, which is not very good at giving us an idea of what people feel like or think like, or the way they narrate their own attachment to place. And do we need a shift also within the smart cities paradigms towards qualitative data, but also tools for bringing about qualitative data, and hence also ways of producing institutions and city planners that are able to be geared towards qualitative data?
Thank you. Who would like to go first? Oh, you've got it.
Oh, thanks. And starting with the second question about bringing the political back in. Is this working? Yeah. I've got a lot of problems with the smart city internationally. I don't think China's the best place to look for bringing the political back in. But even in cases which are in cases where there's supposedly a lot of citizen participation and co-creation, I think it's a very different sense of the political from a traditional, if you like, liberal democratic one, which is to do with structural changes. You'll find a lot of talk about, co-creation rather than actually a real sort of political discussion or political change. So it's sort of, it's not a real sense of the public forum for me. It's doing things, creating things together in a very designy way. I think there's an actual risk that smart city ideas performatively exclude politics at a very deep epistemological level, and they seem to be attacking the type of institutions through which we've traditionally conducted our politics, or we've imagined that we've conducted our politics. So I'm not sure about that. In terms of thinking about assemblages and reconfigurations and comparative models, that's an analytical tool, I guess, to allow comparative lessons to be learnt for whatever reason. So I'm just sceptical generally about the possibility for the smart city to bring politics back in.
So I think your first question about this, what I really came across in doing the interviews was that no one knew what a smart city was and what it meant. And some people actually found freedom in that, so that they could say, oh, well, then this for us can be, it's about basic infrastructure, or it's about CCTV, which is what I think it's mostly about in reality. And so in a way, I think that was told to me as if this is the Indian way of doing smart cities. It's not China's way. It's not your European way. This is our way. But I found that quite problematic, because I think in the not knowing, it's still unknown and it's not very helpful. And actually, when engaging then, if you can't be clear about what it is that you're engaging people with, you then have a fundamental problem with that engagement. And I think the one thing that I felt was, yes, there was all this sort of ambition, and I think speaking to municipalities, they're like, oh, we went out, and I've never been to Islam, and that was amazing. But, and credit for doing that. But when you set up a whole mission, which is explicitly meant to be getting ideas and visions from people, and then you don't listen to any of those things, and you don't actually take them on board, you end up doing that sort of democratizing inequality, which is sort of Maguire's fantastic text. And I think that's what the real risk of this faux participation is, which will have a very long-term effect in India. And I think, along with climate change and inequality, I do believe that the distrust in the state is one of the major challenges that we face today. And that kind of faux participation is a problem there. Which then links to, I'll come back to about the data. So about the awareness, yes, largely there was a lot of branding, which was just communicating like, oh, this is a smart cities. And one of the huge problems in the whole conception of the mission was that cities only had 2 months to engage. Not even the best engagers can do anything in 2 months. So that was already something that put the cities on a back foot and should have been done differently. I still to this day don't understand why they were given 2 months to do a huge task. And the second thing about the competition format is, which is actually something that I think its origins come back to the UK, where cities would compete for national funding, but actually only one city would actually win. And I think, historically, like Liverpool has won through competitive bidding. The odd thing about this competitive process was that ultimately everyone was going to win. I've never also understood that. So now going back to the danger, I think, of this faux participation is that what we should be doing, and going to your point about institutions, what should be happening is empowering municipalities. I think it was mentioned today that we really need to strengthen local governments, and particularly in a city like India, like some of these cities have the population of New York and a sort of a fifth of the management in planning terms. And of that fifth, most of the people are just accountants and then cleaners. So, and in small cities, wherever that is, you don't have any engineers, any architects, any planners, and it's mostly accountants who are making really big decisions. And so my worry with the smart cities is that rather than empowering municipalities and empowering their capacities, it's a real rollback and a push to an SPV, which I'm not going to go into right now. And yes, I think you're absolutely right. Globally, I think we have a huge problem with the love of data sets, and particularly with the sort of snazzy graphics, that ends up having a huge impact on where money lands. A small case study that I was recently involved with here in the UK was we were looking at jobs on high streets, and the government was only recording jobs on high streets with people who have a P45. If you've ever gone into your high street, look around and think who's on a P45. And so in a way, the sort of the data that you look at can have a major impact on the way that money lands in communities, and can have a huge discrepancy, and that can explain why in planning terms we prefer Westfield to over our local high street. I've diverged and I should stop talking.
Just to pick up on the question on what is smartness. I mean, that is obviously the big question, certainly the objective of the day and our research projects. And I agree with both of you all that it's deeply rooted in terms of what local realities sort of articulate as smartness. But I think it's important for us to keep in mind the scales at which that local rootedness occurs. So at one level, I think smartness is deeply connected with personal freedoms. Right? What the city enables you as an individual to do or not to do, I think has to do with how smart it is. But then you can scale all the way up to cities being globally connected, cities being open to migrants, not focusing on where cities end, but what they connect to. These are all questions of smartness, and they all have aspects to them that are infrastructural, and so depend on the physical sciences or the natural sciences. But indeed, as we've all said, they're also deeply political, deeply social, and so bring a different disciplinary approaches to them. To me, individually, for instance, I found it a city like Vancouver deeply smart, because it allows you to go skiing in the morning and spend your afternoon on the beach. And that type of smartness means something very different in different cities. Sorry? If you can afford a house, right? So that's exactly what I was getting to. So that type of smartness is catchy in particular discourses, but completely is exclusionary to the ways of life for most urban dwellers. And so that dual nature of being connected with personal freedoms is just as important as cities somehow being these global connected nodes of living well and thriving.
Just one more, a direct answer to the question, how do we know when we live in a smart city? I think it's a very problematic question. Internationally, the smart cities manifested on the ground materially, largely through experimental projects, pilots, test beds. It's all very tentative. It's all about social learning. It's almost endless learning. So are we in this phase of, instead of making plans and policies, all we want to do is have an endless process of experimentation. We're always on the road to somewhere else. So I think that the smart city can be thought of as something that happens on the road to somewhere else. But we still need to articulate where it is we're trying to get to, what structural changes we're trying to achieve as a result of all this endless experimentation.
Okay, we have 2 minutes for 2 quick questions, and I can see 2 of you there. Great.
Very quick question. First of all, thank you, Jaideep, for your citation twice. And I'm going to build on Rob's and your comment, because I think that you are right when you are talking that we need to move from the smart city to experimental cities, for example. But if we need to do it, I think that we need to start experimenting through the scales in governance. And it's funny because in the morning we've been talking about the dichotomy between the rural and the urban. And I was just talking around here saying that I think that the scales, the multi-level governance is going to be the key. And for instance, it's not exactly the same the way in which Bristol or Glasgow has been developing their strategies in this country. And it's why I wanted to, I would like to include one topic here in the workshop, and it's what's the role of devolution for these kind of things?
So I had a whole bunch of questions, but I'll be quite quick. So this is for Jaideep. I am particularly interested in the relationship between SPVs and municipalities, and I'm a student at King's, and that will be the major focus of my thesis. I'm interested in your experiences working with these two entities. How do they engage with each other? Within the 4 examples that you have, Bhopal, for instance, the entire ABD area was completely, unofficially scrapped. So whatever was in the proposal when it was chosen as a smart city no longer is the actual place where they're going to hold it, because even though they said they did participation there, the actual slum area was not informed, and it was only when bulldozers were coming in that there was sort of a retaliation. So I think this is 2 parts. So 1, in general, SPVs and municipalities, and 2, the informality of this. So there hasn't been any actual change in the smart city proposal on the website or when Bhopal talks about it publicly. But obviously when it materializes, it's going to be very different. So how does this happen all informally within a state organization?
Over to you.
It's me. It was I find it very appealing to think regionally in terms of all these goals, the broader city regions, but perhaps that's always an opt-out answer to where we should set our goals. But I think we should admit that experiments take place at a very local level. The goals that we're going to should take in a region as a whole. But yeah, a lot more work needs to be done on that scale of question. Very interesting.
Can I just touch something on the devolution? Because I think devolving powers is really important, but what we've seen in the UK is devolving decision-making, but not devolving the funds. And so when you don't actually have the money to then spend those local decisions, you have a real problem. And that was fundamentally the huge sticking point with the localism bill. And I think you see that similar in parallels in India with the Smart Cities mission, where you're supposedly devolving powers to cities and to citizens to make those visions, but ultimately the SPV is held by the state still. And so actually that decision-making power, if we accept that that's linked always to money, there hasn't actually been a genuine devolution of power. And I think I'll hand over to you about the SPV, but I don't know, it's a shifting landscape, but when we were doing our fieldwork, it was expressed that there was always going to be a real tension between who is actually the CEO of that SPV. Originally, it was meant to be this kind of like, corporates do it best, so let's get an awesome CEO from Harvard to run these things. But then the cities were realizing that you can't get an awesome CEO from Harvard to run these things who's going to work with the municipalities. So you had kind of people parachuted on top to be the CEO, and there's huge local power dynamics at play. And where the mayors sit in all this, I have no idea. So it's and it's on a city-by-city basis. So I think if you want to draw conclusions for the mission, that's very difficult because each SPV will be set up differently.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And in many ways, those 2 questions are deeply linked for the context of India. So devolution is definitely the big ticket question. But as we were speaking in the break, in India, devolution seriously touches a sore nerve, which is political funding. Right? Political parties leverage cities as cash cows, and that forms a huge portion of their political operating budgets, the ways in which they articulate their fundraising in cities. And so for us to have truly devolved authority means reshaping that political structure. And that's not going to happen anytime soon, and is a deeply complex question. And in many ways has shaped how the SPVs actually function today, right? And I completely agree. I mean, you walk into some of these offices and you can't tell where the municipality starts or ends and who's in the SPV, and certainly the most glitzy sort of computers will be with the consultants, who are also at times in the same premises. So it's a very informal relationship. But still, there are these important processes that are happening. And I think those are really worthwhile studying. And so every chance you get to understand how a CEO, the data officer, the point contact for community engagement are operating on a day-to-day basis is absolutely essential in understanding how the smart city mission is sort of turning out. Certainly, municipal governance in itself is a black box, right? You basically assume the mayor can do everything. But in the smart city context in India, it is a complete sort of mystery in terms of how these day-to-day interactions happen. And the reason I'm putting such a stress on it is that very quickly we're going to get a groupthink, because every city is going to want to show that they've done their bit, they've got this money, tick, and off to the next thing. And we're going to lose out on understanding how these compromises, trade-offs occur within what we call urban local authorities. Right? It's such a complex space.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think we need to wrap up that session. Thank you to our speakers.